FiLiA means daughter. We are the daughters of the women who came before us, and we fight so that our daughters may be free. We are a women-led volunteer organization. Our vision is a world free from patriarchy, where all women and girls are liberated. We seek to contribute to the women's liberation movement by building sisterhood and solidarity among women, locally, nationally, and globally. By amplifying the voices of women, particularly those less often heard or purposefully silenced, and by defending women's human rights.
Dear visitors, thank you for coming today to the FiLiA webinar, Sex Trade Survivors Demanding the Global Change. I am LUBA FEIN from FiLiA. 13 survivors from 12 different countries are taking part in this webinar. I would like to introduce our second speaker, and I'm very excited about it because this speaker influenced my personal activism. Sabrinna Valisce, a globally acknowledged public speaker and a Nordic Model advocate. She was among the first ones to shake the foundations of the decriminalization myth. Decriminalization is a legal model that aims to fully legalize and normalize the sex trade, including setting up licensed brothels with loose regulation. And Simone referred to it in her speech. This legal model has been implemented in New Zealand since 2003. Prior to its implementation, and while being still trapped in the sex trade, Sabrinna campaigned for decriminalization. She genuinely believed that decriminalization would improve the work conditions and the quality of life for women in the sex trade. And in 2003, her campaign achieved its goals. The law has changed. Legal brothels were open throughout the country. Sabrinna could just spend the rest of her life leveraging her political achievement, right? But as she witnessed the vastly expanding, decriminalized sex trade in its cruelty, she refused to remain a part of the pro-prostitution lobby. Living a movement and ideology is never easy. You lose your friends, work, platforms, and social support circles. But being a woman of courage, Sabrinna sacrificed it all for the single purpose of telling the world the truth about the inhuman, racist, and misogynistic face of the decriminalized sex trade that sweeps women's dignity for pimps and johns, profits and comforts. Today, Sabrinna Valisce is the South Pacific representative of Space International, one of the most influential survivor-led NGOs nowadays. Sabrinna is here with us to share the truth about the decriminalized sex trade in New Zealand. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. That was really powerful and amazing. It's interesting to hear what other people have to say, you know, the way they perceive you, because, you know, I perceive myself pretty ordinary. Now, can everyone hear me properly? I just want to start there before I go on. Yeah? You can all hear me? Great. Okay, so I want to give a bit of an idea of the way New Zealand perceives itself first, so that you can understand the mindset of Kiwi people. So New Zealand perceives itself as progressive from both the left and the right political spectrum. And the reason for this comes down to three main events in New Zealand. One of them is being the first country in the world to give women the vote. And unlike many, many other countries, when New Zealand gave women the vote, or more to the point when women fought and won the vote, it was all women. from 18 years and over. So there was no, you didn't need to be married, you didn't need to own property. It wasn't over the age of 25. It included Indigenous women, it included migrant women. So if you were a New Zealand citizen or a permanent resident of New Zealand, you had the right to vote. So it didn't come with caveats. And that's one of the reasons that New Zealanders perceive themselves as progressive. Another was the Springbok Tour, which was actually a rugby event. But what happened was there was an anti-apartheid raid of the streets. People literally started smashing shop windows, running down the streets in protest. And it was one of the largest protests. It was across the entire country. And it was against South African it was an anti-apartheid thing against South African apartheid situation, because South Africa was playing against New Zealand in the rugby. And this was something that the right and the left came together on, and they interrupted the national sport to do it, which is a big deal. It's the only time throughout all of New Zealand history that the rugby has been interrupted for a political reason. So that's another reason for New Zealanders to perceive themselves as progressives. And the third one is the breaking of the ANZUS Pact. Now, ANZUS was Australia, New Zealand, and the United States. And New Zealand, the smallest country, stood up against the, superpower of the world and said no to nukes. And again, this was an issue that people on both the left and the right came together for. And so they broke this pact with the most powerful country in the world in solidarity over having no nukes in the country and no uranium mining either. And to this day, New Zealand is nuclear free as a result of that. So this gives you a backdrop as to why, when decriminalisation came in, full decriminalisation, which means there is no criminal element to prostitution at all. So the pimps are decriminalised, third-party profiteers of all types decriminalised, punters are decriminalised, and the women and the men in prostitution are decriminalised. This is why the country thinks, oh, this is progressive. Nobody else has done it because we're so progressive. They don't think no one else has done it because it's a failure. And these three events that I've just talked about are what has built up this understanding of ourselves as a progressive country that does things before everybody else. Another factor is marriage equality, which, though we weren't the first country in the world to have marriage equality, we had civil unions. Civil union was outside of religion, recognised by the state, union between any two people. Actually, it could even be a heterosexual couple, but for the most part, it was same-sex couples were able to be recognised legally. So we've had that for, I think, since 2001. Anyway, that's the backdrop I wanted to give you to get the mentality. Now, why would decriminalisation be the understanding of what's progressive? And there is a history to this. We had a Jack the Ripper copycat, and this was prior to decriminalisation. The police did not even bother investigating until there was one murder where they believed it was a woman who was not in prostitution. And they started investigating and trying to find the Jack the Ripper copycat. Then they discovered, oh, actually, this woman was in prostitution. And they dropped the case and stopped trying to find him and went, oh, well, it's only those women. And that was in the media. It was very big news. And the police were scrutinised a little bit for it, but for the most part, the public at the time went, yeah, whatever. And it was dropped. So that was the only real newsworthy stuff prior to decriminalisation, outside of a prostitute was murdered, a prostitute was raped. That might be the only things you'd ever see in the media. So when full decriminalisation came along, and suddenly it was a sex worker was murdered, and there is an investigation, and we are trying to get the murderer, and then they did, and that murderer went to jail. that was considered the most progressive moment in the history of the sex trade in New Zealand. It was the first time that the police had ever bothered giving a shit about a woman being murdered in prostitution. So this is the backdrop to people saying it's working, it's the right thing. And you're hard pressed to find a journalist in New Zealand who will even bother thinking about interviewing somebody. And I have been interviewed twice now in New Zealand media. Both times I have had my words twisted and cut at places in order to try and back up full decriminalisation as the right method to go. The first time I said that I would not be giving horror stories, that I just wanted to talk about the everyday reality. The only quote they took was, "I'm not prepared to talk horror stories." And they made it sound like I hadn't given the interview. I had done a 2-hour interview with them. And the other time that I was interviewed, they cut the interview into sections, and they got a pimp to respond. And then they made it sound like I hadn't been anywhere near prostitution during decriminalisation when I actually had been. So this is the kind of thing you're up against, to the point that I actually refuse to do interviews in New Zealand now, because I know that the result is not even going to be to actually get the voice out of the Nordic model. Yeah, it's the suppression within New Zealand is so much so that I don't think even Kiwis know how much the media is suppressed. Now, to have a look at this idea of progressivism, I just want to say all the things that aren't progressive about New Zealand. Abortion was only just removed from the criminal code in 2020. That's last year. It had been illegal right up to that point. So up until last year, a man could pay for sex with a woman. He could pay to rape a woman, but a woman could not get an abortion. So that tells you how we're not really a progressive country. We have the highest domestic violence rates in the developed world. That we have got Jacinda Ardern, who is our Prime Minister, and she is put through legislation to try and make it easier for women in domestic violence to leave. However, it's only going to work for a woman who is employed, whose employer is prepared to pay her 4 weeks leave while she's not actually working, so that she can leave that situation. So we also have, out of the 17 OECD countries, we have the highest rate of rape, the highest rate of sexual assault, the highest rate of street violence, and the highest rate of domestic violence. And it's 1 in 3 women and girls, and 1 in 7 boys and men who are raped in New Zealand, 1 in 3 women and girls, and 1 in 9 men and boys who suffer from domestic violence. This is not the case pre-2003. We didn't have those rates of violence. We were on par with the US, where it is 1 in 6 and women and girls, 1 in 13 men and boys. It has skyrocketed since 2003. Now, we can't say that it is as a result of the Prostitution Reform Act 2003, but we can say there's a correlation between the increased rates of violence in the country and that law being passed. So there may be other factors. If there are, I don't know what those other factors are. We have also had pushback from local councils. Christchurch City Council and Manukau City Council have both tried to overturn the Prostitution Reform Act 2003 through council legislation. And in both cases, they were told they weren't allowed to do it because New Zealand only has one system of parliament. We don't have state and federal, we have what's called MMP. So this was passed at what would be the equivalent of a federal level. The reason that both Christchurch and Manukau tried to overturn it was because the street prostitution had made certain areas extremely unsafe for residents, and this was mostly women and children. And it also meant that there were being bottles being thrown out of car windows from men. There were condoms being left on the streets, and people were pissing and shitting in the neighbours' gardens and things like that. So there was also needles left on the streets. So we're talking from drug use here. This is exactly what you expect to happen when you have prostitution decriminalised, because there's no, I guess it's just left. There's no law that is going to protect anybody, and there's no law that was going to criminalise anyone. You just have a grey zone of whatever happens, happens. And so residents are powerless to clean up their streets. Women in prostitution are powerless to get any services to help them get out, because you can't have services to help somebody leave something that isn't considered wrong. That's like saying, why aren't there exit services for people in accounting? Because it's considered normal. Well, prostitution is now considered so normal that people consider it a job, not any kind of violation of a woman's body. The law itself, when it comes to trafficking, there is no trafficking law. It's not even recognised as a possibility in New Zealand. Domestic trafficking, sex trafficking are not recognised. Labour trafficking has only been recognised within the last 5 years, and that is usually from Tonga and Samoa for men. It isn't so much women. With domestic trafficking and sex trafficking, those are the areas that are mostly women, and they have not been recognised. There is one line in the whole Prostitution Reform Act 2003 that refers to trafficking but doesn't actually use that word, and that's section 19, where it makes it illegal for any person who is not a citizen or permanent resident of New Zealand to be in the sex trade. What that means is it's considered a visa violation. So the person who is caught in it is the criminal. So in other words, trafficking victims are criminalised, prosecuted and deported. This is after they have been put into holding cells. So they're held in custody until deportation. Now, considering the majority of our trafficking victims are from Thailand and Korea, this means that when they are deported home, they are trapped in prostitution for the rest of their lives. Their family will disown them. Their friends will not talk to them. This is the culture. It's considered a moral issue to them. They believe that the women are immoral. So that is like a death sentence. These women will die in prostitution. That is the fate of any woman who is deported from any country for prostitution. So, we're not doing anybody any favours, and we're really not taking trafficking seriously. Now, the NZPC, this is the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, who pushed for full decriminalisation, is trying to get this one sentence removed from the Prostitution Reform Act. If it's removed, it actually makes it even worse. It means that there will be nothing to stop women from being trafficked. In fact, it will decriminalise sex trafficking in New Zealand. It'll effectively do that. There'll be nothing there to stop women from being trafficked, nor will there be any reason to pull them out of prostitution, and it can go on indefinitely. So while the situation is dire right now, it can actually get worse, and there is a lobby trying to make it worse. So that's the main thing that we're trying to do at the moment, is to look at trying to get anti-trafficking laws specifically introduced in New Zealand, so that if that line does get removed, there is something else to catch the traffickers. There's been one case of a person being caught as a trafficker, and they weren't actually called a trafficker at all. They were in violation of visa laws, and they went to jail for only about 4 years. So it wasn't even a real punishment, nor does it have anything to do with a sex crime. It's a visa crime. So they have more rights than somebody who has been done for statutory rape, who may have only been 17 years old and in a relationship with a 15-year-old. That person will have a sex crime on their record, whereas a human trafficker in New Zealand won't. That gives you an idea of how this, how disrespectful the New Zealand laws are to migrant women who have been trafficked in. Okay, to wind it all up, I think in New Zealand, the main thing that needs to happen is services to help women have other options. And it really doesn't matter what the name is at this point, because once those other options come in and women start using those services, I think the conversation will be able to be begun as to why women are exiting the prostitution circles and, well, why women are exiting the sex trade. Right now, we can't even have that conversation. People are not open to hearing it. There needs to be, I guess, a bit more of an en masse push for the services, which will then give women a chance to meet each other. And that will then, you know, bring a bit of a rise to being able to speak out and be heard. So we are 50 paces behind the 8 ball on this one. It's not even at a point where we can push for the Nordic model. So yeah, that's what I've got to say about that. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sabrinna.
Thanks.
You know, you see what a brilliant analysis of the sex trade, which is a cancer that corrodes the entire society. And see what it does. And see what the pimp lobby is often saying that we speak over the sex workers' heads. But when we have a brilliant abolitionist, an intellectual, who can supply such a clear analysis of the sex trade situation, they silence her. They twist her words in the media. They bring a pimp to respond to her speech. What can pimp respond to what Sabrinna said here? He has nothing to say. He should shut up and listen to her.
They're a bit kind of worshipped in some ways because they're worshipped for the wealth, and they give. It's almost like the whole hip hop culture has come into that as well, of, you know, pimping being cool, and that's taken over in New Zealand.
So, so pimp can speak over Sabrinna's head, but abolition survivors cannot speak over sex worker heads, and pimp is a sex worker. So,
yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much, Sabrinna.
Thanks
for being today with us. And now may I ask some questions to our panelists that I got in private. I will start with the question for Sabrinna Valisce, because the question is about New Zealand. And it was that in more than 10 years ago that was published a report about New Zealand that found out that since the decriminalization, the amount of women in the sex trade in New Zealand didn't change. Like, we have the same number of women before the decriminalization and after the decriminalization. So does it mean that decriminalization doesn't affect the size of the sex industry? This is the question.
Okay, so you've got to first understand how the record keeping was done. It was done by the pro-decriminalisation sex lobby. So what would happen was somebody from the NZPC, the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, would go through the newspaper and check off the amount of phone numbers. And that's how they would count the number of women in prostitution. And then they would also count the number of women in brothels when doing outreach. And outreach was twice a week, where they would go and sell condoms, lube, and dental dams. And so that was how the numbers were reached in the first place. The way they did it after full decriminalisation was exactly the same, but this was only 3 years later. So they didn't include anybody who didn't go in to see them, or anyone that they didn't see when they did outreach. So that, you know, this is drop-in centre, only people who came into the drop-in centre, or people that they saw there, or phone numbers, unique phone numbers in the newspaper. It didn't include any internet advertising, street work, anyone that they missed in any kind of advertising in local newspapers, only in the main newspaper. So it's a flawed system. You know, a lot of people don't access NZPC, and not all advertise. When we look at, like when I was in it, I noticed that shifts went from having 4 to 8 women on them to having 30 women on a single shift. That's a huge increase in women. The streets, there's in Auckland, there's an organisation that did notice that the numbers had tripled since then. So, you know, those statistics though, you know, they're not going in there. It's only the ones given by NZPC, who are biased and have a reason to want to say that there's been no increase.
One last question for Sabrinna, because she has to leave us. Is it true that in New Zealand, most women in prostitution are Indigenous?
They're overrepresented. So I don't know about the actual numbers, but there is 3 times more likely, a greater likelihood that an Indigenous woman will enter prostitution compared to a European descent woman.
And what would you recommend to answer when we are told that New Zealand model greatly differs from German? Many people say in German they're doing it wrong, in New Zealand they're doing it perfect. So what can we answer to them?
Well, the first thing I would do, if somebody was saying that to me, I'd say, well, what's different? I would try and turn it back on them. You tell me, what do you think is different? Because most people say that and they've got no answer to that question. And then when you point out that in New Zealand, you know, while there's decriminalisation, you still have to pay taxes. You don't have any rights. There's, you know, if you go to the police, you still have to actually prove that something has happened, and your name is going to go into the public. And that means that anytime you go for a job after that, there will be a record of you having worked in the sex trade. The stigma is still there. So even if you are highly qualified for a position outside of the sex trade, go for that. You're unlikely to get an interview. That it's still going to keep you trapped in that cycle. On top of all of that, you know, we've got all-inclusives, which is the same as a flat rate brothel. You know, we've got all of these different names for exactly the same thing. And the pimps are idolized as though they are doing something good, and they're masquerading as businessmen.
Thank you very much, Sabrinna, for your answers. Again, very educated, and this is the truth about the decriminalized sex trade.